A child's hopscotch grid holds the secret blueprint for ancient justice. The story of Encoded in clay reveals how the games we consider simple pastimes built the legal systems that shaped civilization for thousands of years. You will discover the direct link between playful rules and the laws that governed millions, a connection preserved on fragile clay tablets. How did a game of chance evolve into a code for fair trade? What does a king's piece on a board have to do with a judge's authority in court? By the end, you will never look at a game board the same way again. What childhood game do you think taught the most important lesson about fairness? That laughter echoing across a sun-baked courtyard was humanity's first courtroom. In the dust of Mesopotamia, children were not just playing, they were conducting a vital social experiment. The simple act of drawing a grid and tossing a stone created a world governed by agreement. Everyone present accepted the same basic rules. They decided who would take the first turn. They defined what a successful move looked like, and when a stone landed on a line, they had to negotiate. Was it in or was it out? This was not a trivial matter. It was a practice session for life. Anthropologists see these games as our earliest safe spaces for conflict. Within the magic circle of play, children could test the limits of fairness without real-world consequences. A dispute over a game piece was a low-stakes rehearsal for a future dispute over property or trade. The cognitive framework being built was profound. These games taught that rules are not just arbitrary commands from an adult. They are a shared construct that makes the activity possible. They instill the idea that for a group to function, everyone must operate under the same understood code. This is the absolute bedrock of any legal system. Before a king could decree a law, a child had to learn why taking turns was essential. Before a judge could settle a boundary dispute, players had to agree where the lines were drawn. The primordial playground was, in fact, a training ground for civilization itself. That alternating rhythm of play, the simple act of waiting for your turn, is where justice truly begins. Think about the royal game of one of the world's oldest known board games. Two players sat across from each other, rolling dice and moving their pieces along a set path. The entire experience was built on a foundation of strict alternation. You rolled the dice, you moved your piece, and then you had to wait. You watched your opponent take their chance. There was no rushing the process, no skipping the line. This was not just a rule for fun, it was a profound lesson in fairness. It taught that for an activity to work, for it to be perceived as just, everyone must have an equal opportunity to participate. This principle leaped directly from the game board into the courtroom. Ancient legal scholars gave this idea a powerful Latin name, audi alteram partem, which simply means hear the other side. It is the bedrock of modern legal procedure. In the earliest surviving legal codes, we see this concept codified into law. A plaintiff could not simply shout down a defendant. Both parties were granted a formal, structured opportunity to present their version of events before a judge. This ensured a balanced process, preventing one voice from dominating simply because it was louder or spoken first. The predictable, alternating structure of a child's game taught a civilization that true order does not come from chaos or force, but from a mutual respect for procedure. The patience learned while waiting for a turn with a game piece became the patience required to listen to an opposing argument. The fairness inherent in taking turns became the fairness demanded by a legal system. It was a direct translation from the clay game board to the clay tablet of law. A line drawn in the dust was the first law of the land. The hopscotch grid and the Senet board did more than just organize play. They created a world of absolute clarity. Every square had its edges, every space its defined purpose. To step on a line was not a minor mistake. It was a fundamental violation of the agreed-upon reality. That immediate consequence, the loss of a turn, was a powerful, physical lesson about limits. It taught that boundaries are not suggestions, they are the very structure that prevents chaos. This logic of the grid was a cultural blueprint waiting to be scaled up. As small villages swelled into bustling city-states with thousands of inhabitants, the abstract idea of my land and your land became dangerously vague. How could you prove where your field ended and your neighbor's began? The solution was etched into their collective memory from childhood. The surveyors who mapped out the first agricultural plots and city lots were essentially drawing a giant, permanent game board onto the earth itself. On ancient Sumerian clay tablets, we see records of land sales and property disputes, and the diagrams are strikingly familiar. They show precise, measured rectangles, neat lines dividing one plot from the next, echoing the squares of a gaming board with an uncanny resemblance. The playground rule of out of bounds had evolved into a legal cornerstone. Trespass was no longer just a broken rule of a game. It was a broken law of the community with real penalties. The sacredness of the boundary line, first learned by avoiding a chalk mark, became the foundation for all property law. But before a single piece is moved, something far more important happens. The players agree. They pledge, even if only with a nod, to abide by the same set of rules for the duration of the game. This voluntary submission to a shared framework is a miniature social contract, a tiny model of a society governing itself. This simple act of agreement before play was a revolutionary concept waiting to be scaled up. Consider the immense challenge of ancient trade. A merchant from the city of would travel for weeks to reach a market in a distant land. He did not share their language, their customs, or their gods. How could he possibly trust a stranger to give him a fair price for his goods or to deliver the promised amount of grain? The answer was found in the logic of the game board. Just as two players established the rules of Mancala before the first seed was dropped, these merchants would establish the rules of their exchange before the first item changed hands. They would negotiate the price, the quantity, and the delivery date, and then, crucially, they would record this mutual agreement on a clay tablet. This was not just a receipt, it was a formal contract. The integrity of their transaction depended entirely on both parties honoring the words etched into that clay, just as the integrity of a game depended on both players honoring the rules they had accepted. From this practice emerged one of the oldest and most enduring principles of law, a Latin phrase that echoes across millennia: Pacta sunt servanda, agreements must be kept. This was not a suggestion from a king, but a necessity born from the fundamental trust required for any cooperative endeavor, whether it was a simple game or a complex trade network that spanned the known world. The promise made over a gaming board was the direct ancestor of the promise that bound empires together. A whisper of a rule could be forgotten by the next sunrise. The great leap from games drawn in the dust to laws carved in clay was a revolution in human thought. It was the moment our collective memory received a physical backup, a durable record that could outlast any single person. The key figures in this transformation were the scribes, trained in the quiet halls of temples and palaces. With a stylus in hand, they pressed the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform into wet clay, capturing everything from epic poetry to tax records. They did not distinguish between the sacred, the administrative, and the recreational. The very same script used to record the rules for the royal game of was used to inscribe the laws that would govern an empire. This was the birth of codification, the process of taking ideas and making them concrete, permanent, and accessible. The most famous example, the Code of Hammurabi, stands as a towering monument to this idea. It is literally encoded in clay and later in stone, a vast list of if-then scenarios that reads almost like a rulebook for society itself. If a man steals an ox, then he shall pay 30 times its value. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. This logical structure of specific conditions and prescribed consequences is precisely how you would explain the rules of a complex board game. The act of writing transformed justice from a fluid, personal memory into a fixed public standard. A dispute was no longer settled by whose story was more persuasive or who had the better reputation. It could now be settled by referencing an external, unchanging text. The law became a thing that existed outside of any individual, a permanent record that could be consulted, debated, and enforced for generations. The playground's understanding of fairness had just grown up, finding its voice not in a shout, but in the silent, enduring marks on a tablet of clay. A game is only fair if the punishment fits the crime. That moment when your stone skids onto a hopscotch line and you lose your turn is not arbitrary, it is a perfectly logical outcome. The penalty is immediate, understood by all players, and directly tied to the mistake. This principle of objective consequences is the invisible architecture supporting both play and the law. Ancient legal minds did not invent the idea of punishment from nothing. They scaled up a concept that every child already understood from the gaming board. The Code of Hammurabi is often remembered for its harsh symmetry, an eye for an eye, but its true genius lies in its nuance, its graduated system of penalties. Stealing a loaf of bread did not cost you a hand, it cost you a fine of 30 times the bread's value. Causing a minor injury through negligence required a payment of silver to the victim. These were not random punishments, they were carefully calibrated consequences designed to fit the specific nature of the offense. This tiered system is a direct echo of the gaming world. In a complex board game, a small misstep might only cost you a single turn or a few points, a temporary setback. But a major violation of the core rules, like cheating or refusing to accept a legitimate move, could mean immediate forfeiture of the entire game. The legal code simply adopted this same logical framework. It taught a society that justice is not a single, blunt instrument, but a set of precise tools. A minor civil dispute required a small, restorative penalty, while a violent crime demanded a severe, life-altering consequence. This predictability was everything. Just as a player learns to avoid the line because they know the specific penalty, a citizen learns to respect property and person because they understand the specific legal repercussions. The gaming board provided the model for a system where accountability was clear, consistent, and perceived as fundamentally fair by the community it was meant to govern. The dice that tumbled from a child's hand carried the seed of impartial justice. That moment of pure chance, the unpredictable roll that could crown you the winner or send you back to the start, taught a difficult but vital lesson. You had to accept an outcome you did not choose, an outcome that was not personally favorable. This was not about skill or strength or argument. It was about submitting to a force beyond your control. The game was fair precisely because it was random, because it did not play favorites. This psychological acceptance of an impartial arbiter was a cultural training ground. When early legal systems faced their most intractable disputes, cases with no clear evidence or conflicting testimonies, they turned to this same principle. They viewed chance not as chaos, but as a divine instrument, a way for a higher power to speak through the fall of lots or the reading of omens. A verdict delivered by a caste of sacred knucklebones was seen as a judgment from the gods themselves, a decision beyond human corruption or bias. The populace, already conditioned by a lifetime of games, understood this logic. The same resignation you felt when a bad dice roll cost you the game was the resignation required when a legal judgment went against you. It fostered a belief in the system itself, a trust that the process was larger than any individual's desire to win. This was the monumental shift from the rule of brute force to the rule of law. It was the understanding that a neutral, sometimes random, process was ultimately more just than a decision made by the strongest or loudest person in the room. The dice of destiny, first rolled on a game board, became the foundation for a judiciary that aspired to be blind, weighing the evidence and not the individual. A chess master does not see only the pieces on the board, but the dozens of potential battles yet to unfold. This ability to think in sequences, to anticipate an opponent's counter-move and plan your own response 3 steps later, is a form of mental time travel. It is strategic foresight, and it is a skill honed for thousands of years on game boards across the ancient world. This cognitive leap, from reacting to the present to planning for the future, became the engine for one of law's most powerful concepts, the principle of precedent. Imagine the challenge facing the first judges. Every dispute that came before them was a unique puzzle. Without a guide, each ruling would be a solitary event, a flickering candle in the dark. But what if they could link these decisions together? What if a judgment made last year about a stolen sheep could inform a judgment made today about a disputed boundary? This is precisely what they began to do. Scribes meticulously recorded verdicts on clay tablets, creating a growing library of legal outcomes. A judge facing a new case could consult these records. He was, in effect, studying the classic games of his predecessors. He would look for a past case with similar facts and see how it was resolved. That past ruling became a guide, a template for the present. This was the birth of legal precedent. It transformed law from a series of isolated reactions into a coherent and predictable system. A merchant entering into a contract could now have some confidence in the outcome of a potential dispute because he could point to how similar agreements had been treated in the past. The law gained a memory. It was no longer just about what was fair in this single moment, but about maintaining consistency across time. This created a stable foundation upon which commerce and society could safely build. The strategic thinking required to win a game of Go, to see the entire board and its future states, was the very same thinking that allowed civilizations to build a legal system that could endure for generations. The next move was always guided by the last. A game board could hold the entire cosmos within its grid. For the ancient Egyptians, the game of Senet was far more than entertainment. It was a sacred map. The board's 30 squares were believed to chart the perilous journey of the soul through the Duat, the underworld, toward rebirth and the afterlife. Every throw of the casting sticks, every move of a piece, was a symbolic act governed by a strict, unchangeable ritual. This was not a game you could cheat, because you were not just playing against an opponent, you were navigating a divine order. The rules were a fixed reality, as immutable as the path of the sun. This symbolic function transformed the gaming board into a powerful model for the state itself. Just as a player moved their pieces according to the sacred rulebook of Senet, the pharaoh governed his people according to Mot, the principle of cosmic truth, balance, and order. The pharaoh was the ultimate player, moving the pieces of society across the board of the kingdom, ensuring every action aligned with a higher law. When a citizen sat down to play, they were not merely passing the time. They were actively participating in a miniature version of their own civilization's core belief. They were rehearsing the acceptance of a structure where movement was not random, but directed by a set of principles that were both just and divinely ordained. The authority of the game's rules, which everyone accepted to make the activity meaningful, seamlessly transferred to the authority of the state's laws. If you could trust the rules of Senet to guide a soul to salvation, then you could trust the pharaoh's decrees to guide the nation to prosperity. The game board legitimized governance through a medium that felt familiar, respectful, and profoundly true. It taught that the law was not merely a human invention, but a reflection of the universe's own design. Even the most perfectly designed game requires a final voice of authority. When two players reached an impasse, when a move was too ambiguous for the rules to cover, the game itself could not solve the problem. It needed a person, someone standing outside the competition, to deliver a verdict. This was the birth of the arbiter, often an elder sibling or a respected friend who knew the rules inside and out. Their power did not come from strength or age alone, but from a mutual agreement, a shared consent from the players to accept their judgment as final. This neutral figure was the prototype for every judge who would ever sit on a bench. In the formal legal systems that followed, this role was institutionalized. The knowledge of game rules became a knowledge of legal codes. The authority granted by a nod between children became the authority granted by the state. The core principle remained unchanged. Justice could not be left to the accuser and the accused, whose perspectives were clouded by the desire to win. It required a disinterested third party, a professional listener whose only allegiance was to the process itself. This established a system where the law, not personal vengeance or raw power, would have the last word. The respected elder on the sidelines of a Senate match was, in essence, the first incarnation of a principle that would uphold civilizations, the belief that a fair decision comes from someone who has nothing to gain from the outcome. The rules of the game were a story passed from one generation to the next. A grandparent did not simply teach a child how to move pieces on a Senate board. They were initiating them into a living tradition. With each roll of the dice, they recounted the myths behind the symbols, explained why certain moves were forbidden, and instilled the quiet dignity of accepting a loss with grace. This was not mere instruction, it was the very mechanism of cultural memory. Around the fire or in the shade of a courtyard, the complex web of social values, from honesty to respect for elders, was woven directly into the fabric of play. This oral transmission acted as a resilient, decentralized library, ensuring that the core principles of how to live together survived long after individual kings or empires had turned to dust. When the time came to codify these principles into formal law, the method of passing them down felt deeply familiar. The elders and priests who held the legal knowledge did not merely hand a clay tablet to a young scribe and walk away. They sat with them, explaining the nuances of each statute, the intent behind the punishment, the famous cases that established a precedent. The student learned not just the words, but the spirit of the law, much like a player learns not just the rules of a game, but its underlying strategy and honor. The clay tablets themselves were a technological leap, a permanent backup for this collective memory. Yet the true integration of law into society happened not through the cold clay, but through the warm, living practice of teaching and learning. A citizen did not encounter the law as a frightening, foreign decree posted on a palace wall. They recognized its logic because they had already internalized a version of it since childhood. The law felt like an extension of the rules they already knew, a natural part of the cultural fabric reinforced every time a new generation sat down to play. The community was not being ruled by a code, it was participating in a tradition it had helped to create. Buried alongside golden daggers and lyres in the royal cemetery of Ur, a simple wooden board reveals a profound secret. This 4,500-year-old artifact is the royal game of Ur, and its intricate playing surface was a training ground for the mind of a merchant. The game was a frantic race with players throwing dice to speed their pieces along a set path, but the true challenge lay in the strategy. Certain squares offered sanctuary, safe from an opponent's capture. Others placed your piece in immediate peril. Every move was a calculated risk, a decision to advance aggressively or to retreat to safety. This was not mere chance, it was a sophisticated simulation of threat and opportunity. At the very same time, in the bustling markets of Sumerian cities, merchants were etching the rules of commerce onto clay tablets. These contracts detailed complex partnerships, loans with interest, and the consequences for failing to deliver promised goods. The cognitive parallel is astonishing. The game's logic of navigating safe squares and hostile captures directly mirrored the merchant's world. A business venture was a race against competitors, where a safe square was a reliable business partner or a secure trade route. A hostile square was a market crash, a bandit attack, or a defaulted loan. The penalties in the game for a poor move, like losing a turn or having a piece sent back to the start, taught the same lesson as the financial penalties in a commercial contract. A merchant who had spent a lifetime playing understood this framework intuitively. He had already internalized the core concepts of risk assessment, strategic blocking, and recovery from setbacks. The game board was his flight simulator for the high-stakes world of ancient economics, a place where he could practice the very same strategic thinking that the clay tablets of law demanded. That wooden pawn on a chessboard is never just a piece of carved wood. In the hands of a player, it becomes a foot soldier, a symbol of sacrifice and strategic advance. This power of representation was the secret language of ancient games. The pieces themselves were loaded with meaning. In the royal game of Ur, certain tokens were believed to represent friendly spirits or hostile demons. In Senet, the pieces were the souls of the players navigating a divine obstacle course. Moving these symbols was not a mechanical act, it was a form of storytelling. Each turn advanced a narrative of conflict, a spiritual journey, or a reflection of the social hierarchy right there on the board. This cognitive habit of seeing a small object as a stand-in for a larger, more complex idea was a cultural training program. It prepared the human mind for one of the most profound transitions in history, the shift from oral tradition to written law. A clay tablet was not just a lump of dried mud with scratches on it. It was a symbolic representation of an entire agreement, a debt, or a royal decree. Its power did not come from the clay itself, but from the abstract concept it now physically embodied. This is why the seals pressed into these tablets were so vital. The mark of a king, or the cylinder seal of a witness, was not a simple signature. It was the legal equivalent of placing the king piece on the board. That seal transferred the immense, abstract authority of the crown onto the physical document. Everyone who saw that seal understood its meaning instantly, just as a player understands the unique power of the queen in a game of chess. This mental leap was everything. It taught people to respect not the object but the idea it represented. You obeyed the law on the tablet not because the clay could enforce it, but because you respected the authority symbolically present in the seal. This was the foundation of a society governed by documents and codes, rather than by the whims of the strongest warrior in the room. The symbolic world of the game board had trained an entire civilization to accept that a simple mark could hold the power of a king. The words themselves carried the blueprint from the playground to the palace. Across the ancient world, the very vocabulary used for games became the formal language of justice, creating a linguistic bridge that made abstract legal concepts feel immediately familiar. In Akkadian, the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, the word for a legal case or a formal plea was intimately connected to the words for a contest, a dispute, or a rivalry. This was not a simple metaphor, it was a shared root, revealing that in the minds of the people, a court case was a specific kind of structured contest. The entire legal process was framed using this inherited logic. A plaintiff did not just bring a grievance, he made a move in a formal proceeding. The defendant responded with a countermove. The judge was not merely a decider, but an overseer ensuring fair play, that both sides adhered to the established rules of engagement. This linguistic overlap made the intimidating machinery of the law feel less alien. For a common farmer summoned to court, the process was daunting, but by understanding it as a kind of game, a highly serious one with strict procedures, he could find his footing. He knew he had to wait for his turn to speak. He understood that there was a correct sequence to follow. He recognized that the goal was to win, not through force, but through a more persuasive presentation within the boundaries of the rules. This shared language demystified power. It transformed the law from a terrifying decree handed down from on high into a recognizable system of interaction, one that every person had practiced in some form since childhood. The courtroom became the ultimate game board where the moves were arguments and the prize was justice. A fair match requires more than just identical rules. It demands a genuine chance for both sides to succeed. This fundamental yearning for equity, first felt when choosing teams for a game, became the emotional engine driving the creation of law. When the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu commissioned one of the earliest known legal codes, he did not begin by listing punishments. He began with a proclamation declaring his purpose was to establish justice in the land, to banish enmity and violence, and to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. This was not empty political rhetoric, it was a direct response to the collective cry for a level playing field. The law code was the tool to make that ideal a reality. It was society's attempt to ensure that a wealthy merchant and a poor farmer, when standing before a judge, were both subject to the same set of rules. The arbitrary advantage of power or status was, in theory, neutralized by the consistent application of the law. This transformed the playground principle into a civilizational pillar. The same emotional satisfaction a child feels when a game is perfectly balanced, when victory is earned through skill and not through an unfair head start, is what a citizen feels when they believe their legal system is truly just. It is the profound comfort of knowing that the rules are not just written, but that they are designed to give everyone, from the mightiest to the most humble, an equal shot at justice. The proof is baked into the clay itself. In the ruins of ancient cities like Uruk and Nippur, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of these humble tablets. To the untrained eye, they might look like nothing more than broken pieces of pottery covered in chicken scratch. But in the hands of a philologist, a scholar of ancient languages, they become a time machine. These experts painstakingly decipher the wedge-shaped cuneiform marks, and what they find is astonishing. One tablet might list the rules for a popular board game, detailing the values of dice throws and the movement of pieces. The very next tablet in the same archive could record the verdict in a property dispute or the terms of a business loan. Sometimes the handwriting is identical, proving the same scribe who recorded the king's laws also wrote down the rules for a child's pastime. The physical format is a powerful clue. Both types of documents were created on palm-sized rectangles of wet clay, inscribed with a sharp reed stylus, and then left to harden in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence. There was no distinction in the medium because in the minds of the people, there was no vast separation in the concepts. Finding a list of game pieces and a legal contract in the same archaeological layer, buried in the same room of a temple or palace, is not a coincidence. It is concrete evidence these two spheres, the recreational and the legal, were woven from the same cultural thread. These fragile tablets are the ultimate silent witnesses. They do not shout about kings and battles. They whisper the everyday story of how a civilization learned to think. They show us the direct path from the rules that governed an afternoon's amusement to the rules that would govern a million lives for thousands of years. A chant before the first dice roll transformed play into something more than a simple pastime. These opening rituals, whether a mumbled prayer or a ceremonial toss, did more than just start the game. They cast a kind of magic circle around the players. This formal beginning signaled a shift from the ordinary world into a space governed by its own sacred order. Every action that followed, from the movement of pieces to the declaration of a winner, was part of a structured performance. This ritualistic framework was not left behind on the game board. It was borrowed directly by the earliest courts of law. A legal proceeding in ancient Mesopotamia was never just a debate. It was a solemn performance with a strict script. The proceedings would open with invocations to the gods of justice. Witnesses swore oaths by placing their hands on divine symbols, calling upon higher powers to strike them down if they lied. The judge's final verdict was not a casual opinion. It was a formal pronouncement, often delivered from a raised dais to emphasize its authority. This entire ceremony was designed to do exactly what the game's ritual did, to elevate the activity above the mundane. It transformed a dispute between two neighbors from a personal squabble into a matter of cosmic balance. The predictable sequence of events, from the oath to the judgment, provided a profound sense of psychological comfort. In a world full of unpredictable famine, disease, and conflict, the rigid structure of the legal ritual was an anchor. It signaled to everyone present that justice was not happening by chance or by the whim of a moody official. It was a deliberate, orderly process that unfolded the same way every time, regardless of who was involved. This performative consistency was the bedrock of public trust. When people see that the system follows its own rules with ceremonial precision, they are far more likely to believe in its fairness and to comply with its outcomes. The ritual was the proof that the law itself was worthy of respect. That playful training of the mind was a biological preparation for the rule of law. Cognitive scientists call this process scaffolded learning, where complex skills are built one by one upon a foundation of simpler ones. The games of the ancient world were not just fun, they were a rigorous mental gymnasium. Every time a child waited for their turn in a frantic race game, they were strengthening their impulse control. Every moment they planned 3 moves ahead on a Senet board, they were honing their executive function, the brain's ability to strategize and manage complex tasks. And every time they tried to guess what their opponent would do next, they were practicing theory of mind, the crucial ability to understand that others have their own thoughts, intentions, and strategies. These are not just abstract psychological terms, they are the fundamental cognitive muscles required for any society to function under a legal system. A citizen must be able to control the primitive impulse for immediate revenge, and instead trust the slower, more deliberate process of the courts. They must be able to plan their business dealings and personal actions while carefully considering the legal boundaries, the written rules of their society. And they must possess a well-developed theory of mind to anticipate how their actions will be perceived by a judge, or how a new law might affect their neighbors. By engaging in rule-based play from their earliest years, ancient societies were conducting a mass, informal training program for the brain. They were not merely teaching children the rules of a game, they were forging the neural pathways necessary to comprehend, to respect, and to successfully operate within a system of codified laws. This made the monumental leap from small tribal groups to vast, lawful civilizations not just a political or social evolution, but a natural psychological progression for the human mind itself. The most dangerous human instincts could be tamed with a roll of the dice. Deep within our competitive drive lies the potential for conflict, the raw impulse to dominate a rival for resources or status. Games did not try to eliminate this powerful energy. They gave it a safe and structured arena in which to play out. Two men with a simmering land dispute could settle it over a tense match of Senet, their aggression channeled into moving pieces instead of drawing weapons. Victory on the board provided a psychological resolution, a clear winner and loser that satisfied the competitive urge without bloodshed. This was a civilization learning to substitute a symbolic contest for a real one. The legal system was the ultimate institutionalization of this brilliant alternative. It offered a formal, public stage where any grievance, from a stolen sheep to a broken contract, could be presented as a case rather than a casus belli. The courtroom became the new, highly regulated game board for social conflict. The plaintiff and defendant were the players, their evidence and arguments were their moves, and the judge was the ultimate arbiter ensuring fair play. A verdict backed by the authority of the state replaced the need for physical victory or violent revenge. This was arguably one of humanity's most vital cultural inventions. By redirecting the energy once spent on internal feuds and cycles of violence into a structured process of dispute resolution, societies unlocked a new level of stability. That stability became the foundation for everything else. It allowed for the accumulation of wealth, the growth of long-term trade networks, and the pursuit of knowledge and art. The countless lives saved by this simple substitution, the choice of a gavel over a sword, created the peaceful space necessary for civilization to truly flourish. The gavel strikes and the trial begins, a ritual that still carries the ghost of ancient games. Our modern courtrooms, for all their complexity, are built upon a foundation of play. When we speak of someone having their day in court, we are using the precise language of a gaming board, affirming their right to a formal turn to present their case. The entire adversarial system, the heart of common law, is a direct institutionalization of a two-player contest. A prosecutor and a defense attorney do not merely argue, they make strategic moves and countermoves, bound by a strict rulebook of procedure and evidence. This rulebook exists for the same reason game rules do, to ensure what we still call fair play. The physical space of the courtroom itself is a telling echo. The judge sits elevated not as a king but as a referee overseeing the match, ensuring neither side commits a foul. The opposing parties face each other across the room, just as players would sit across a Senet or a board. And the jury, seated to the side, fulfills the role of the community that once gathered to watch a high-stakes game, observing the contest to reach a collective verdict. This is not a cold, impersonal machine of justice. It is a deeply human institution, a formalized structure for our most serious conflicts, born from the same primal desire for order and fairness that once led children to draw a grid in the dust. Recognizing these playful origins reminds us that the law was never meant to be remote or alien. It is an extension of our most basic social instincts, a grand and solemn game whose ultimate prize is a functioning society. A secret rule is the death of any fair game. If one player holds knowledge the others do not, the entire foundation of trust crumbles. This fundamental principle of transparency was the final, revolutionary gift that games gave to the law. For centuries, legal knowledge was not a public resource but a guarded treasure, an oral tradition held by elders, priests, and ruling elites. The law was fluid, open to interpretation and manipulation by those in power. A common farmer could never be certain if he was breaking a rule he had never been allowed to hear. The act of carving laws into clay and erecting them on towering stone steels for all to see, as with the famous Code of Hammurabi, shattered this monopoly on knowledge. It was a public declaration that the rules of society were no longer a secret. The logic was precisely that of the gaming board. Just as every child had the right to learn the rules of Senet before playing, every citizen now had the right to know the law by which they would be judged. This was the ultimate democratization of justice. It transformed the law from a weapon of the powerful into a shield for the common person. A merchant could now point to the public stele and argue that his actions were within the written code. A judge's ruling could be checked against the permanent, unchanging text. This transparency was the bedrock of accountability, a powerful check against the arbitrary exercise of power. The law was no longer a whispered secret in the halls of the elite. It was now a shared rulebook etched in stone for everyone to read, just as the rules of a game are drawn in the dust for all players to see. Yet the board game is always put away at the end of the day. This is the crucial, sobering boundary where the playful analogy meets its limit. A lost game means you start over tomorrow, your pieces reset and your honor intact. A lost legal case, however, can mean the permanent loss of your property, your freedom, or even your life. The consequences do not vanish when the players stand up from the table. They ripple outward, altering lives and families forever. This is the first great divergence, the chasm between the voluntary world of play and the compulsory reality of law. You can choose not to play a game, but you cannot choose to opt out of the legal system that governs your society. The ancient lawmakers understood this profound shift in stakes. They took the voluntary framework, the mutual agreement that made games possible, and transformed it into a social contract that was not optional. This required a monumental leap in abstract thinking, to envision a set of rules that bound everyone, willing or not, for the ultimate purpose of collective survival. The objective itself also transforms. In a game, the goal is clear: to defeat your opponent. There is a winner and a loser, but in a mature legal system, the goal is not merely to crown a victor. It is to restore balance, to ensure social harmony, and to discover a truth that serves the entire community. The ideal verdict is not one that crushes the loser, but one that resolves the dispute in a way that allows the community to heal and continue. A judge might rule in favor of one party, but then structure the penalty in a way that prevents a cycle of vendetta. In this sense, a truly just legal outcome has no true loser, only a society that has been stabilized. Recognizing where the analogy breaks down does not weaken the connection, it deepens our awe for the ancient achievement. It was not a simple copy and paste from the game board to the law code. It was a creative, sophisticated adaptation. They took a model designed for temporary, voluntary fun and re-engineered it into a permanent, binding structure for millions. They understood that the core logic of rules, turns, and fair play was sound, but that its application to real human conflict required a gravity and a compassion that no game could ever demand. This blueprint of play was being drawn simultaneously across the ancient world. Far from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, in the lush river valleys of ancient India, a different kind of game was shaping the mind of the state. It was called Chaturanga, and its board was a battlefield. The game pieces were not abstract tokens. They were direct representations of the four divisions of the Indian army: the infantry, the cavalry, the chariots, and the war elephants. Every move in Chaturanga was a lesson in military strategy, and by extension, a lesson in the laws of war and statecraft. A player learned to protect their king piece at all costs, understanding that the entire game hinged on its safety. a direct parallel to the legal principle of protecting the sovereign and the stability of the realm. The game taught coordinated attacks, the strategic sacrifice of lesser pieces for a greater advantage, and the importance of positioning. This was not mere recreation for generals. It was a cognitive training ground for the complex rules of engagement and the hierarchical structure that underpinned ancient Indian law and administration. A ruler who mastered Chaturanga was practicing how to deploy real resources, how to manage real conflicts, and how to think several steps ahead in the governance of his kingdom. Across the Himalayas in ancient China, philosophers contemplated the board of Go. This game, with its simple black and white stones, was a universe of subtle strategy. The goal was not to capture a king, but to gradually secure territory and influence through encirclement. Confucian and legalist scholars saw in Go a perfect model for governance. The Confucian ideal of social harmony was reflected in the delicate balance of power on the board, where aggressive expansion could leave you vulnerable and where patience and foresight were rewarded. The legalist focus on strict, predictable rules and the strategic use of state power was mirrored in the game's unforgiving logic, where every stone placed had a long-term consequence. Playing Go was a meditation on how to rule, teaching that control was not about brute force, but about the careful, calculated application of pressure and the wisdom to know when to consolidate and when to expand. This philosophical grounding directly informed the legal codes and administrative practices that would bind Chinese civilization together for millennia. Perhaps the most dramatic fusion of game and law occurred in the steamy ball courts of Mesoamerica. Here, the game was not a quiet contest of minds, but a brutal, physical spectacle. The Mesoamerican ball game was deeply woven into the fabric of religion and politics. The court itself represented the cosmos, and the movement of the heavy rubber ball symbolized the journey of the sun and stars. The outcome of a major match was far from trivial. It could decide the fate of entire cities, legitimize a new ruler, or determine whether captives of war would be sacrificed or freed. In this context, the game was the law. It was a divinely sanctioned method of dispute resolution on the grandest scale, a ritual that translated human conflict into a sacred contest whose verdict was considered the will of the gods. The players were not merely athletes, they were intermediaries in a cosmic legal proceeding. From the strategic armies of Chaturanga to the territorial balance of Go and the divine verdict of the ball game, we see the same pattern emerging independently across the globe. This was not a cultural fluke, it was a universal human strategy. Faced with the overwhelming complexity of organizing thousands of people into a coherent society, our ancestors repeatedly reached for the same cognitive tool. They used the structured, logical, and emotionally engaging framework of games to model, to practice, and ultimately to codify the principles of justice, order, and governance. The game board was humanity's first and most universal simulator for the law. The rules of a game are never truly final. Someone, somewhere, will eventually discover a loophole, a strategy so effective it breaks the intended balance of play. When this happens, the players themselves often step in to amend the rules, adding a new clause to restore fairness and fun. This dynamic process of adaptation is not a flaw in game design, it is its greatest strength. Ancient lawmakers observed this principle in action and understood its profound application to governance. The Code of Hammurabi, for all its permanence etched in stone, was not the last word. Subsequent rulers in Mesopotamia did not treat these legal texts as untouchable relics. They actively amended them, issuing new decrees and supplementary tablets to address unforeseen circumstances. A new type of contract dispute, an emerging form of trade, or a shift in social norms would prompt the creation of fresh legislation. This was the legal equivalent of adding a house rule to a board game. The underlying framework remained, but the specifics evolved to ensure the system continued to function smoothly for everyone involved. This established a revolutionary concept that law is a living entity. It must breathe and grow alongside the society it serves. A legal code that could not adapt to new technologies, like the invention of more precise scales for measuring grain, would quickly become obsolete and unjust. A set of rules that ignored new economic realities, like long-distance maritime trade, would stifle progress and create chaos. The willingness to thoughtfully change the rules, always with the goal of improving the grand game of society, is what allowed these early legal systems to endure for centuries. It was a quiet admission that no single generation could foresee every challenge, and that justice itself sometimes requires an update. From the dust of ancient playgrounds to the fired clay of legal archives, the journey of human law is a story written in the language of games. We have traced a path from the first chalk lines of hopscotch to the indelible marks of Hammurabi's code, watching how the simple, universal principles of turn-taking, boundaries, and fair play were scaled up into the very foundations of civilization. This enduring connection reveals law not as a cold, distant imposition of power, but as a deeply human extension of our innate desire for order and fairness, a desire first explored, tested, and honed in the safe space of childhood play. The next time you see children negotiating the rules of a game or patiently awaiting their turn, remember that you are witnessing more than mere amusement. You are observing the living roots of justice itself, the primal workshop where the blueprint for society is still being drawn. If this exploration of our shared past has intrigued you, we would love to hear your thoughts. Which modern games, from complex digital worlds to classic board games, do you think might be secretly shaping the ethical and legal frameworks of our future? Share your ideas in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden connections of history. This story of clay and childhood offers a profound kind of hope for our own times. Our towering legal systems, with all their intricate procedures and dense volumes of law, were not born in sterile halls of power alone. They emerged from the dusty courtyards where children laughed and argued over a game's rules. This reveals that our deepest capacity for justice, for creating order out of potential chaos, is not a fragile cultural overlay. It is hardwired into our social DNA, an innate skill we begin practicing almost as soon as we can walk and talk. The drive to be fair, to take turns, and to honor an agreement is as fundamental to the human experience as language itself. We were building the blueprint for civilization long before we ever built the first city wall. As we face our own era's complex ethical dilemmas, from digital privacy to global governance, we often search for answers in radical new technologies or impossibly complex regulations. But the story encoded in clay suggests we might be looking in the wrong place. The most durable solutions may already be within us, waiting to be rediscovered. They are the simple, powerful principles we internalized in our earliest games. The need for rules that everyone can see and understand. The wisdom of listening to the other side before making a judgment. The courage to accept an outcome even when it is not the one we wanted. These are not childish ideas. They are the bedrock upon which every lasting human institution has ever been built. The next great leap in justice may not require inventing something entirely new, but rather remembering something very, very old. It calls us back to that foundational respect for the process itself, to the clarity of a line drawn in the earth and the integrity of a promise made before the first move is ever taken.